Okay, this is my uncle here, and I'm recording him about the Vietnam War. What role did you have in the Vietnam War, and why did you join?
I was a fuels officer in Vietnam and in the U.S. and we handled all the fuels, whether it be gasoline or diesel fuel, into trucks or cars, and all of the aircraft fuel, whether it went into reciprocating aircraft, which was using what they call aviation gas, avgas, or JP4 jet fuel, which went into the jets and turbojets.
Okay, what was your, why did you join?
I didn't have much choice to join. I was graduating from college in 1968, and it was either join the Air Force and become an officer or get drafted to the Army and become a private. I chose to become an officer and serve in the Air Force since I had an uncle who was a career Air Force officer.
All right, what was a typical day like while you were serving?
When I was in Vietnam, I was at a base called Cam Bay, which was a big seaport and Air Force base, well, Navy seaport and U.S. Air Force base. I probably woke up, I think, usually about 6:30, and then went down and had breakfast at the chow hall, and then usually got to work by about 7:30, 8 o'clock, and most days worked till 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. My guys there, I had about 150, both in Vietnam and also in Thailand. They tended to work 12-hour shifts, which with 3 days where they worked 12 hours, and then they had 2 days off, then worked 2 days, and so yeah, that'd be 7 days. So they had 3 on, 2 off, 2 on, and 2 off, and then 3 in. They worked 12-hour days. I usually worked 6 to 6.5 days a week while I was there.
Okay, what was your most memorable moment while you were serving?
It was 2 memorable moments. My first rocket attack, when I had only been there a couple weeks, and I heard a loud boom at about 2 in the morning, and then I heard the whistling of rockets coming in, which immediately I grabbed my helmet, flak jacket, and ran to the bunker. And the second most memorable event was my last day on active duty, where I was then stationed at a base in Thailand near Vientiane, Laos. And my last day of active duty, we got hit with a sapper attack, so my airplane out of Southeast Asia was canceled, and I took my dress blues off, which we then had to use when we were flying on airplanes, put my fatigues on, and then crawled around my fuel trucks and fuel tanks looking for explosive charges, which we found none. The Viet Cong didn't get that far. And then later that day, put my blues back on, packed up my fatigues, and then left Thailand to go back to the U.S.
Okay, how was the American reaction back at home during the war?
It was bad. There was all the protests and marches, and I think was in 1968 they had the big Democratic convention here in Chicago, where the Chicago cops were beating everybody up, and there was a lot of anti-war protests back then, and as far as I was concerned, very close to anarchy in the U.S. There were lots of riots in the streets, and a lot of people against the war.
Okay, what were some difficulties that you had to overcome during your service?
The big thing was being away from family, 10, 12,000 miles away from home. At the time, and my family was back in western Pennsylvania, and I was in South Vietnam. That was probably the biggest thing, but I was lucky that I made friends of a young enlisted guy at what they called the Mars station, the military affiliated radio station. So when he'd get good connections on ham radio, connections to the U.S., he'd call me up, and so about every week or 10 days, I'd call my family back home in Pennsylvania from Vietnam, and we'd talk shortwave radio, which is kind of funny because, like, when I'm talking to you now, I'd say, Max, how are you doing? Over. And then you would say, I'm doing fine, Uncle Bob. Over. And then I would talk. So we couldn't talk at the same time. Since it was a shortwave radio broadcast going across the world. It was also funny that when you're talking sometimes to relatives, that people would be listening throughout the world, and sometimes they would chime in. You'd say, "Bye, I love you," and you'd hear, "I love you, I love you, I love you." You know, people from throughout the world chiming in. So it was kind of interesting. It was humorous, but kept me in contact with the family back in the States.
Okay, so that really leads me to my next question, which is, what was the media coverage like?
Media coverage was bad. What was really bad was oftentimes the media was so much on the front line that I remember stories of moms and dads seeing pictures of their sons being dragged onto helicopters and being killed while photographers were taking pictures in Vietnam, and the parents would get to be notified by the military that their son or daughter was either killed or wounded in action. But the media was really very, very anti-war at the time. There was very little pro-war coverage, and in many instances, rightfully, because it was a very political war, meaning that the politicians in Washington were watching over everything that you did, and in fact, literally had to approve every single bomb that was dropped. I knew pilots that saw targets and one that had dropped their bombs, but it wasn't on an approved bombing list, and therefore they had to drop their bombs over the jungle. They called it pickling their bombs before they came back to the base and landed, because they weren't allowed to hit specific targets, even though they were being shot at, and or they knew that they were enemy troops there. They weren't allowed to drop the bombs on them.
Okay. What were you told you were fighting for when you were in service? How did you feel about fighting in Vietnam? And did you have any doubts about the war?
Actually, I don't think I was told very much about fighting. It was just the fact when you go into the military, you take an oath of office that you would defend the Constitution of the United States and obey the orders of those above you. So it wasn't very much explained what we were fighting for, etc. It was basically, hey, I enlisted and I took the oath of office, and I had to do what I was ordered to do, or what I had to do to survive. I had to do what I had to do to survive, and I had to listen to the orders of those above me in order to keep from getting in trouble. And I missed, what was the end of that question?
Did you have any doubts about the war?
Not when I was there. I had doubts when I came back. I kind of feel that Nixon and Kissinger sold us out over the Paris peace talks, because I knew a lot of the pilots, and I came back right before, probably a year before the war was ended, and when we did the Christmas Day bombing back in, I think, 1972 or 73 or something like that, we basically had all of the industry wiped out in North Vietnam, and could have walked in, but the Kissinger and the North Vietnamese and Chinese said, let's talk, and so we went to Paris and signed a peace treaty, and then a year later the North Vietnamese and the Chinese walked into Saigon and took over the entire country.
Okay. How was your life before the war and after the war?
Well, very simply, before the war I was going to college, going to college, and after the war I was just working. And it wasn't very much different, other than I had more free time after the war than before the war, because I worked during the day and went to school at night, so it wasn't too much difference. I was still working both before, during, and after the war.
Okay.
Well, I should say one thing. My military service, especially my tour in Vietnam and Thailand, gave me a lot of management business experience, and so I was probably much more confident in myself.
All right. What was the impact of the war at home?
Well, the impact of war at home, I think, is pretty much tore the country apart. You were either pro-military, anti-military, or I should say pro-war, anti-war, and unlike today, if you were anti-war back then, you were also anti-anybody who was in the military. Whereas now you have people against the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, but they're still tubes. It wasn't that way back then. We came back and we were called anything from baby killers to worse names than that.
Okay. What were your expectations before the war, and was it what you thought it would be after the war?
My personal expectations?
Yes.
I just wanted to survive and get out of the military and get on with my civilian life, but I went into the military in 68, got off active duty in 72, but actually then stayed in the reserves because I enjoyed the military until I got out in 1995 out of the reserves. So before the war, I was just going in and because I had to serve, but once I started serving, I decided that I kind of wanted to continue to serve.
Okay. And then, so if you could, would you fight in the war again?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You got it, guy.